Chapter 8 Star of the Show. "You look great," Mandy said to Amy. It was Saturday evening. Mandy and Amy were backstage waiting for the show to start. There were children everywhere. Those with pets had them safely secured in cages or travel baskets. "You look good too. Your grandma is really good at making costumes," Amy said. "Nobody will guess what mine is made from." Mandy nodded. There hadn't been much time to make anything complicated for Amy, but Mrs. Gardner had found an old gold-colored curtain, which she and Grandma had made into a short, swirly skirt with a little cape. Amy's hair was tied up with a big golden bow, and she wore red boots to cover her bandage. She looked terrific. Mandy, the wizard's apprentice, was wearing a bright green cap and a short red tunic over her blue tights. James was trying to stop Blackie from jumping up at him. "It's the wand," he said. "He wants me to throw it for him." "That's because it's part of his part in the play," Mandy said. She took Blackie by the collar and hauled him off stage. She dug her hands deep into the pocket of her tunic and brought out a couple of dog treats. "That's bribery," said Pam Stanton, walking past with Ginny the guinea pig. "It works," said Mandy, as Blackie gobbled up the dog treats. "There are thousands of people out there," Gary Roberts said, peering through a crack in the curtain. Gertie was draped around his neck. Mandy came over and stood beside him. She gave Gertie a stroke. Then she saw the crowds. "Wow," she said. "All of Welford has turned up." Gary laughed. "Look at Mrs. Ponsonby," he said. "She's in the front row." Mandy looked. Mrs. Ponsonby was sitting up straight in her chair, talking loudly to anybody who would listen. "She's told the whole village that Mr. Spallini is a dangerous spy," Jill Redfern said behind them. Mandy turned around. Jill was giving Toto's shell a final polish. "Doesn't he look great?" she said. Mandy looked around. Everybody looked great. Gary had a big blue turban on his head. Amy sparkled and shone in her gold costume, and James looked just like a wizard in his tall hat, cloak, and wand. Andrew was like a real villain, dressed up as Horace, all in black. He looked really sinister, a truly frightening giant. Mrs. Garvey clapped her hands softly. "Off the stage now," she said. "We're almost ready to begin." She looked around at all her pupils. "What is it they say in the theater? Break a leg!" Amy looked down at her foot. "I nearly did that already," she said. Everybody laughed, and Mrs. Garvey herded them off the stage. She put her fingers to her lips and pressed a button on the tape recorder at the side of the stage. At the same time, the lights dimmed. The music began, and then the curtain slowly opened. The first batch of children ran onto the stage with their pets, and the show began. The group of children were acting as villagers at a carnival. There were all sorts of performers. There was dancing and singing, and finally all the villagers did a conga around the stage. Then Gary sat in the middle of the stage holding Gertie up while Pam played the recorder backstage. Gary and Gertie were a great success. All the villagers cheered and brought their pets closer to see the fun. But as they gathered around Gary, a black figure appeared at the back of the stage. It was Horrible Horace. The villagers fell back in fear as Horace walked around. He snatched Toto, the tortoise, from Jill and told the villagers what he wanted. If the villagers did not work for him and do everything he said, he would hurt Toto and all the animals in the village. Horace marched to the front of the stage and growled at the audience. Behind him, the villagers huddled together, wondering what to do. Mandy, James, and Susan were waiting in the wings. "This is it," said James. "I'm really nervous," Susan Davis said, putting on her monkey mask. "You were great at the rehearsal," James reassured her. He looked at Mandy. "Ready?" Mandy nodded. "Good luck," she whispered. She looked down at Blackie, standing beside Mrs. Garvey. "It'll be your turn soon, Blackie," she said softly. "You're on now," Mrs. Garvey said, holding Blackie close to her side. Mandy and James walked out onto the stage with Susan tumbling around them. "Oh, Master," Mandy said in a clear voice, "this is a fine carnival, but nobody is having any fun. Why don't you show them some magic tricks?" From then on, Mandy hardly had time to think. Everything worked perfectly. The villagers started having fun again. With the wizard's help, they all ganged up on Horace and tied him up. Pam played the recorder off stage, while Gary swayed about so much his turban wobbled. Jack's and Laura's rabbits received loud applause, and each time Horrible Horace snarled and hissed, the audience booed and hissed back. Susan, the wizard's monkey, did her gymnastics, tumbling around the stage to loud applause. But it was James and his magic tricks that got the loudest cheers. He was wonderful. The play went so fast, Mandy could hardly believe it when the last scene came. Horrible Horace had escaped. He was standing center stage, and the villagers were cowering in front of him, afraid of him once again. He had stolen the wizard's magic wand, and he was going to do something horrible to all the animals. The wizard lay helpless at Horrible Horace's feet. Without his wand, he had no power left. Horrible Horace lifted up the wand and waved it. This was Blackie's cue. Mandy walked on from the wings with Blackie at her side. "Look what you've done to my master," she cried. "You have stolen his wand! You have stolen his power!" Horace raised the wizard's magic wand higher. "And now I'm going to turn all your pets to stone," he snarled. Mandy knelt down center stage right next to James. "Go, Blackie! Get Andrew!" she whispered to Blackie. "Fetch the stick!" Blackie didn't need to be told twice. He made a dive for Horrible Horace and started chasing him around the stage. Horrible Horace threw the wand high into the air, and Blackie leaped for it. Mandy held her breath. Blackie caught the wand and turned to take it back to Andrew. Mandy rattled the box of dog biscuits in her pocket, and Blackie stopped and looked at her. "Here, boy! Here, Blackie!" she whispered. Blackie put his head to one side, and for a moment, Mandy thought he wasn't going to come to her. Then he galloped across the stage, put the wand down at Mandy's feet, and wagged his tail. "Good boy," Mandy whispered, and gave him a biscuit. There were laughs from the audience as he chomped it noisily. Mandy put the wand into James's hand and stood up. "Abracadabra, hubble and bubble. The wizard's wand will solve this trouble," she said in a loud voice. At once James leaped to his feet. The Wizard of Welford had gotten back his power. All the villagers cheered. Then they all went silent again as Horrible Horace started to walk toward James. Mandy held her breath. Now it was time for the best trick of all. Amy was standing beside James. She had a small round object in her hand. Horrible Horace paced steadily toward James. Then James waved his wand 3 times. He swirled round, his cloak billowing behind him. Just at that moment, Amy threw something down on the stage. There was a puff of smoke, and Mandy saw Andrew dive off stage under the cover of James's cloak and the smoke. James twirled again and swept his pointy hat off his head. Mandy watched closely. She saw James reach inside the hat, and there was a silver box. In a moment, he had the box open and held Minnie up for everyone to see. The Wizard of Welford had turned Horrible Horace into a mouse. It was terrific. The villagers on the stage cheered, and the audience cheered. Amy looked as if she would do a cartwheel in spite of her ankle. And, above them all, held in James's hand was Minnie. The little mouse blinked in the bright lights and twitched her long whiskers. All eyes were on the little mouse. She really was the star of the show. "Horrible Horace will never bully the village again," James announced. "I have cast a spell on him, a spell to turn him into a tiny, helpless little animal. The animals of Welford are safe." Then the curtains came down. They had to take 5 bows. Everybody was on their feet, stamping and cheering. Finally, Mrs. Garvey had to come on and ask everyone to sit down. Mr. Spallini is going to give us a very special treat, she said. I think everybody knows how helpful he has been with the play. There was clapping from the audience, and Mrs. Garvey held up her hand again until it died down. Mr. Spallini has agreed to give a magic performance just for us, she said. She turned to the side of the stage and announced, Ladies and gentlemen, the spectacular Spallini! Mandy, James, and Amy sat down on the stage with the other children. Everyone had their pets beside them, safely back in their baskets and cages. Blackie lay contentedly between Mandy and James, wagging his tail. Mr. Spallini began his act. He was amazing. He took 3 silver balls out of Pam Stanton's mouth. He turned Gary's turban into a beach ball. He made Andrew Pearson disappear entirely. He even smashed Mrs. Garvey's watch with a big golden hammer and gave it back to her without a mark on it. He's terrific, said James. He grinned at Mandy. He's the real Wizard of Welford. Oh, he's finished, said Amy. Mandy looked at the stage. Mr. Spallini was bowing to the audience. Then he drew out his arms, and his doves came fluttering down from the rafters above the stage. They settled along his outstretched arms, ruffling their feathers and cooing. Mandy spotted Bianca. The white dove walked up Mr. Spallini's arm and settled in her favorite place on his shoulder. The performance was over. It had all been wonderful. Mr. Spallini turned to look at Mandy. He gave her a wink and raised his arms. The dove circled the stage above Mr. Spallini's head as he swept his hat off. He took a huge bunch of flowers out of his hat and threw them right over the stage toward Mrs. Ponsonby. Mrs. Ponsonby was so surprised, she threw up her hands with a squeak of alarm and caught them. Mandy heard Mrs. Ponsonby say, Well, really? Then she looked at the flowers. She stood up and took a bow as well. Honestly, Mrs. Ponsonby's got some nerve, said James. Who cares, said Amy softly, stroking the little mouse. Minnie is a star. It's magic. Mandy nodded happily. Magic, she repeated. Then she looked at Minnie. It's mouse magic. The end. Well, thank you so much for joining me, Halflings, and finishing up this exciting tale. I had a lot of fun reading it. I hope you had fun listening to it. Until next time, take care and join me for the next book.